Dead America, the Second Month, Atticus on the Rails Part 3. Written by Derek Slayton. Narrated by Aaron Smith. Chapter 1. Day 0 plus 45. Rebuild Day 15. Atticus still had his hat pulled down over his eyes as the train chugged down the tracks towards Moorcroft, Wyoming. The sun had been up for a good 20 minutes or so, bathing the passenger car with light. There were no shadows, as there was nothing but open wilderness on either side of the train. Try as he might to get a few more minutes of shut-eye, the hat was no match for the sun. He sighed deeply to himself. "Well, guess it's time to wave the white flag," he muttered, and took off his hat, putting it onto the seat next to him. He gave his eyes a moment to adjust to the cruelty of the daylight, staring out the window at the snow-capped scenery. Nothing new was falling, but the sun reflected off of the white blanket as far as the eye could see. He looked around for the walkie-talkie, finding it on the table nearby, and clicked it on. "Hey, Bill. You copy?" he asked into the radio. "Good morning, sunshine," the engineer said brightly. "Sleeping in today?" "Been a rough few days," Atticus admitted, shaking his head. "And I get the sense that it's not getting any easier from here on out." "Yeah, I hear you," Bill agreed. "Well, take it easy. Get you some breakfast and hang tight. We got about 20 minutes before we hit Moorcroft. 30 if you need a little more time." The ex-ranger chuckled. 20 is fine, he assured him. "Appreciate you, Bill." "Let's see if you still feel that way when I drop your ass off in the middle of nowhere," the engineer joked. Atticus barked a laugh. "Yeah, you might want to hit reverse pretty quick as soon as my feet hit the dirt," he quipped back. "I'll keep that in mind," Bill replied good-naturedly. "Enjoy breakfast." The line clicked off and Atticus got up from his seat, stretching out his sore muscles from his uncomfortable sleeping position. He made his way over to the food cart, looking around for something even vaguely breakfast-like. He shook his head. "Who the hell stocks this thing?" he murmured as he dug through a collection of pre-packaged chips and beef jerky. But there was nothing even remotely breakfast food. Finally, at the bottom of the pile, he found a cinnamon roll that appeared to have spent the better part of the last few years hiding in the back cupboard of a discount roadside motel breakfast pantry. Atticus inspected it for a moment before finally shrugging and cracking it open. I've had worse," he said with a sigh, and bit into it. He winced and recoiled, spitting his mouthful back into the wrapper. "Ugh. Still, had worse." He shook his head and tossed the offending bun aside, opting for a pack of jerky and a bottle of water before making his way back to his seat. As he munched on the salty meat, he got himself prepared for the day. Everything up to this point had been fairly easy, but for the first time since he'd left Seattle, he began to feel nervous. Walking into an unknown situation with no backup within a few hundred miles wasn't a good start to the day. He quickly shook that thought out of his head. He had work to do before any of that anyway, and he had to focus on the beginning of his list. He had no idea what to expect in Moorcroft, but he was hoping that there was something useful to be found there. He went back to his breakfast, zoning out for a few minutes, just looking out the window and enjoying the scenery. The last few minutes of the golden hour were upon him, the sun casting a perfect line on the landscape, the few clouds in the sky catching a hint of red. Atticus enjoyed the rest of the trip into town, but he snapped out of the moment when the train started to slow down. He got up and took his bag containing all the goods he'd collected up to this point and stashed it in the overhead bin. "Okay, you stay put now," he thought, willing it to the bag. "You're gonna keep us fed for weeks once we get home." He patted the bag before closing the door on the overhead bin. He plunked his hat on his head and walked to the door, sliding it open as the train continued to slow down. The cool air hit his face, waking him up fully with its crispness. He looked out at the tiny town of Moorcroft as it grew closer and closer. Numerous chimneys in town pumped out smoke, and that gave him a feeling of coziness. He was looking forward to a nice warm fire plus some coffee, just what the doctor ordered while he investigated. The train slowly came to a stop at the edge of town. There was no depot, just 40 yards or so of empty space before hitting the first building. As he stepped off, he looked over at some movement, spotting a dozen or so people coming out of the buildings and walking towards the train. There was a woman in the lead with shoulder-length black hair and an athletic build. She looked to be in her early 20s, and her eyes were dead set on the ex-ranger as she sauntered up to him. "You must be Atticus," she said. He offered a friendly smile. "What gave it away?" he asked. "Well, Clint in Seattle told me to be on the lookout for a tall, dark, and handsome cowboy," she replied with a smirk. "Plus, you're the only person on the train, so it made my job a lot easier." Atticus chuckled. "What about him?" he asked, motioning towards Bill, who had dismounted the train and strolled towards them. "For all you know, that could be me." The woman laughed, a hearty sound from deep in her belly. "Who, Bill?" she asked, flicking a hand. "I think the closest he ever gets to tall, dark, and handsome is when he gets blackout drunk in front of a funhouse mirror." "Hey, I heard that," Bill said, feigning offense with a hand to his chest. "And?" the woman quipped, cocking a brow. Bill shrugged. "Well, it's accurate," he admitted, and the trio shared a laugh as he reached them. "Atticus, allow me to introduce Linda." Atticus smiled and extended his hand to her. "It's a pleasure," he said. "Likewise," she replied, shaking his hand with a firm grip. "So, how do you two know each other?" the ex-ranger asked, motioning between them. "We rolled through here when we were clearing a path up to Seattle," Bill explained. "The boys helped her out with a sticky situation. Took out the trash, so to speak." Linda rolled her eyes. "What he means is they came in and took out a bunch of murderous assholes who wanted to make us their subjects," she corrected with venom in her tone. "What's the deal there?" Atticus asked, his eyebrows raising as he turned to the engineer. "I didn't have you pegged as a warrior." "Oh, I very much wasn't involved," Bill assured him, shaking his head and raising his palms. "I got them here and stayed out of harm's way." Before anyone else could speak, he pointed a finger at him. "And before you think I was being all cowardly, I was the only one who knew how to operate this big thing, and Captain Kersey ordered me confined." Atticus smiled, shaking his head. "Don't worry. I would never imply you were being a coward," he assured him. "You're out here making runs in open zombie country. You're kicking plenty of ass, Bill." The engineer chuckled. "Good. Now that we've established that I'm a bona fide badass, let's talk about our current situation," he said, clapping his hands together. "Linda, how long you need to get this train unloaded?" She tilted her head back and forth. "Probably a couple of hours," she asked. "If that's okay." "I have no problem with it," Atticus piped up. "It'll give me some time to find some proper breakfast." Linda offered him a smile. "I can help you out with that," she said. "What else do you need?" He nodded thoughtfully. "Are there any soldiers here who might have come from North Platte or Kansas lately?" he asked. She returned the nod and waved a hand over her shoulder. "I had a small group come in a week ago," she said. "One of them was wounded, so they stuck around so he could recover. This is the first transport we've gotten since then, so they're still confined." Atticus cocked a brow. "Confined?" he asked. "Oh, they're not locked up in the town jail, if that's what you're thinking," Linda assured him. "More like house arrest." The ex-ranger was still just as confused, as that didn't really answer his question. "Something happen?" he pressed. She shook her head. "Not with them in particular," she replied. "Had a few incidents about 3 weeks ago with some soldiers getting rowdy and starting fights with locals. I made the decision to keep any soldiers to themselves in town. I didn't want to outright ban them because I didn't want to risk these shipments, but something had to be done to keep the peace here in town." "That's a shame. Could use their strong backs to unload this stuff." Bill said with a sigh. Linda shot him a playful glare. My people will do just fine, she quipped, then turned to Atticus. Come on, let me show you around. And, Bill, you want me to send some food your way? If you don't mind, Bill replied. Send it over to the bunkhouse. Gonna get an hour or two of sleep before we head out to wherever you decide you want to go. Atticus smiled. Go get some rest, bud, he said. The engineer nodded and wandered off as Linda and Atticus started walking towards town. The ex-ranger looked around at the handful of people out on the streets, everybody heading to the same building on the north side of town. When they got to a cross street, he looked in every direction, able to see the edge of town no matter where he looked. Not exactly a booming metropolis here, he drawled. Linda gave him the side-eye. You say that like it's a bad thing, she accused. Oh, not at all, he replied. In fact, I'm from a small town myself. Her gaze brightened. Oh, she asked. Where from? Little place called Rusk, down in East Texas, he replied. Little bit bigger than this place, but not by much. If it weren't for the snow, it would kind of feel like home. Linda nodded. Hopefully it was isolated like we are, she said. Maybe some people were able to ride out the initial storm. He shook his head. I doubt it, he admitted. It was just a couple hours away from both Dallas and Shreveport. It wouldn't surprise me if they were overrun with people fleeing that madness. It was bad enough around here, and we knew what was coming, Linda admitted. I can't imagine waking up in a city of millions with no clue what was happening. Not to mention the millions of people, Atticus added. That too, she agreed. She trailed off, pursing her lips and staring at the ground, as if she were battling depressing thoughts in her head. Finally, she took a deep breath, raising her chin and changing the subject. So, let me tell you about our town, she said brightly. Atticus realized what she was doing and offered a reassuring smile. I'd love that, he said, hoping it would ease her mind. So, right now we have about 150 full-time residents who live here, she explained. Atticus blinked at her. People who never left? He asked. She shook her head. There's only about 20 or 30 of us who are lifelong residents, she corrected. Most of the rest are civilians who came along with the military out of Kansas, although we had a few come down from Seattle a couple weeks ago to move in. He pursed his lips for a beat. This was news to him. I wasn't aware they were allowing people to move out of the city, he said. There are special cases, and I don't think they're going to be here permanently, Linda said. Too valuable. He nodded thoughtfully. Specialists? He prompted. It would make sense that people who specialized in certain fields would be on loan from Seattle, but need to go back in order to continue to spread their knowledge. Yes, sir, she confirmed with a nod. Got one person optimizing our greenhouses, another person teaching courses on farming. She trailed off, lips curling into an amused smile as Atticus sniffed the air, his eyes going wide with excitement as the scent of freshly baking bread wafted over them. And we have a nice young woman who is teaching our bakers the fine art of bread making, Linda added. If you want to keep her around, you just let me know, Atticus said, raising a palm to his chest. I can totally tell Clint and Gad that she was tragically killed in a baking incident. She laughed, a bright and sweet sound that warmed him. I will keep that in mind, she said through her mirth. And I get the sense that every time I walk by this place, it's going to increase the temptation. A few people stood in line outside of a small bakery. A woman in a flour-covered apron emerged, carrying a full fresh loaf of bread, slices still steaming in the chill air, but hurried off to deliver it to somewhere. An elderly woman from the line glanced over, her eyes lighting up at the sight of the approaching duo. Linda, my dear, she gushed, reaching out a hand. You can go ahead of me if you want to. I know you're a busy woman. We have nothing but time, Miss Harris, Linda replied, offering a 1,000-watt smile as she shook the old woman's hand. But thank you. Miss Harris glanced at Atticus, looking him up and down with a comically appraising gaze. Oh, I get it, honey, she drawled, not even trying to hide the innuendo in her tone. "I get it." She gave Linda a coy wink, eliciting a chuckle. "So, you going to introduce me to your new friend here? Or am I just going to have to put the moves on him myself?" The ex-ranger shot her a grin. "My name's Atticus, ma'am," he said, tipping his hat. "Oh, you stop it with that ma'am stuff," Miss Harris scoffed, waving a hand in his direction. "Old ladies are called ma'am, and I'm young." Atticus smirked. "How young are you?" he asked playfully, leaning in as if it were their little secret. Miss Harris winked at him. "Young enough," she shot back, causing Atticus to bark out a deep belly laugh. Linda chuckled and shook her head, snaking her arm through Atticus's and tugging him up the line. "Now that you mention it, Miss Harris, we are in a bit of a hurry," she said, eyes apologetic. "We will take you up on your offer to go ahead." "Smart girl," the old woman commended, nodding and waving them forward. "You two have fun now." Linda led Atticus into the store, closing the door behind them to stand on the indoor side of the lineup. There were only 2 people ahead of them in the small gap between the door and the counter, everyone waiting their turn patiently. "She seems fun," Atticus said, inclining his head back outside towards the spicy old lady. Linda rolled her eyes. "She's been trying to find me a man since I was in middle school," she drawled. "Some things never change." The ex-ranger chuckled at her plight, and before long it was their turn, one of the bakers waving them up to the counter. "Coffee today too, Linda?" the baker asked sweetly. She nodded and pressed her palms together. "Please," she replied. The baker turned around, grabbing a still warm and fresh-wrapped loaf of bread and 2 ceramic mugs of coffee, setting them on the counter. "Savor the brew, because we're running low," he said quietly, leaning in. Linda offered him a bright smile. "New shipment just arrived a few minutes ago," she informed him. "Oh, thank God," he moaned, putting a hand to his chest as he huffed a sigh of relief. "Going to be a long, dark winter once we run out." They picked up their drinks and bread, walking out the front door. Atticus looked back towards Miss Harris, and she gave him another wink and a saucy wave as they walked off. He chuckled, turning forward as Linda broke off a hunk of bread and handed it over to him. He turned over the piece of warm bread in his hand, bringing it up to his nose and taking a deep sniff of the hearty scent. "This is some magical stuff," he breathed, before taking a slow bite and savoring it in his mouth. "Hopefully, I still feel the same way in a month or so when it's all we have left to eat," Linda said wistfully. "Well, this and dry salad." "If the rumblings in Seattle are to be believed, you might be considering that a feast," Atticus said quietly. She contemplated that for a moment before nodding in agreement. Food was food, after all. "The soldier's house is a couple blocks over," she said, motioning for him to follow her. The ex-ranger nodded, and the 2 of them strolled through the streets, quietly enjoying their hot breakfast of bread and coffee. Chapter 2. Atticus and Linda walked up the street towards the soldier's house. It was a quaint small-town street with a few houses on either side. There was a young girl sitting in the window of one of them, and she waved with an adorable bright smile. "If it wasn't for the knowledge of things outside this town, I'd swear this is a perfectly normal day," Atticus said as he tipped his hat to the girl, offering her a warm smile of his own. "Ignorance is bliss, or so they say," Linda replied. As they walked down the street, one of the soldiers came out of the front door. He was tall and fit, with dark hair and a hard jaw. "Good morning, ma'am," he greeted stiffly. "Morning, Private," Linda greeted, a lot more friendly sounding than him. "It's Harbin, right?" "Yes, ma'am," he said politely. "My apologies," she replied, putting a hand to her chest. "I'm usually pretty good with names, but it feels like 50,000 of you guys have come through here over the last month or so. Everyone is kind of jumbled together into one generic soldier." Harbin chuckled, his expression warming a little. "It's quite all right," he assured her. "You're giving us food and shelter while our friend recovers. As far as I'm concerned, you can get my name wrong anytime you want."
"Appreciate that," she replied. "I wonder if you and your friends could do me a favor and talk to my friend here."
The private nodded and turned to Atticus, extending his hand to shake. "I'm Private Harbin, sir," he said. "Name's Atticus," the ex-ranger replied, shaking his hand. "I'm working for command back in Seattle." Harbin's eyes widened a little. "We're not in trouble, are we, sir?" he asked, voice rising a bit in pitch. "For staying behind?" Atticus shook his head emphatically. "Nah, it's nothing like that, soldier," he said, raising a palm. "Just have a few questions about what was going on in Kansas and North Platte." "Oh, okay, of course," the soldier replied, visibly relaxing. "Not sure how much help we'll be, but we'll answer whatever we can. Why don't you come inside?" He turned, then paused. "Just, please keep your voices down. Our injured is still resting up. We gave him some sedatives, and he's finally resting. Don't want to mess that up for him, given how scarce the stuff is getting." "Understood," Atticus agreed, and he and Linda followed Harbin inside the house. They entered a cozy living room, where another soldier that looked to be in his late 20s with golden blonde hair lay sprawled across one of the couches, reading a celebrity magazine. "Can you believe people actually read about this nonsense?" he asked without looking up from his reading. "Cobb, we have visitors," Harbin said with a hint of amusement in his voice. The private on the couch glanced up, and at the sight of the two newcomers, he immediately tossed the magazine onto the coffee table and scrambled to his feet. "Good to see you again, ma'am," he gushed, offering Linda a smile. "And I'm afraid we haven't been introduced." He turned to Atticus, holding out a hand. "Name's Atticus," the ex-ranger said, and shook with him. "He's from command up in Seattle," Harbin added. Cobb's eyes widened just as the other soldiers had done, and he shut it down just as quickly. "Relax, he's just here to ask some questions," Harbin said. "Why don't you boys go ahead and have a seat?" Atticus invited, wanting to dispel the tense atmosphere. The soldiers took a seat on the couch Cobb had been sprawled on, and Atticus and Linda took the love seat across from them, the former removing his hat and setting it on the table. As requested, Atticus kept his voice low as he leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "What can you tell me about the last few weeks in Kansas?" he asked. "What was your job? What did you see? What kind of rumors were you hearing? Anything at all?" "We were essentially part of the rear guard," Harbin explained. "The closer you got to Wichita, or Kansas City, or really any major city, the more likely you were to run into zombies. When we first got there, we did a pretty good job of clearing out the small towns and keeping the big cities contained. But once we started retreating, those barricades broke down. That started causing trouble." Atticus nodded thoughtfully. "So your job was to cover the retreat, take down zombies and stuff like that?" he asked. Cobb shook his head. "Not really take them down, but create roadblocks to slow them down," he replied. "Some of those mobs got into the thousands, and we had nowhere near enough ammo or manpower to handle that. That wasn't the only threat, though." "People fighting?" Atticus prompted. Cobb nodded solemnly. "We never experienced it firsthand," he admitted, "because we were primarily the roadblock team, but we heard stories." The ex-ranger nodded. "Tell me," he said. "Some of the other teams got ambushed while on the road," Harbin continued. "An IED going off, sniper taking a shot at them from the woods, stuff like that." "Did they ever figure out who was attacking them?" Atticus asked. Cobb shook his head with a shrug. "They just assumed it was locals who were angry at the military for overrunning their town," he said dryly. "Or for leaving. Take your pick." "No confirmation, though?" Atticus asked. Harbin shook his head. "None that we ever saw," he said, but he paused, thinking for a moment, realizing the implication of the question. "Wait, you think the military would have been shooting at us?" "Not the military," Atticus corrected, "but deserters." Harbin leaned forward, eyes wide with shock. "Deserters?" he asked. The ex-ranger nodded. "Wouldn't be the first time it's ever happened, and this situation is perfect for that kind of thing to flourish," he said. Cobb sat up straight, as if an idea had just occurred to him,
and he smacked his companion lightly on the arm. "Wait, you remember that general store in that town on the Nebraska border?" he gushed. Harbin's brow furrowed for a moment as he thought, but he finally nodded. "The one with the graffiti spray painted on the wall?" he asked. "Yeah," Cobb said, nodding emphatically. Harbin wrinkled his nose. "You took that seriously?" he asked, skepticism clear in his tone. Cobb shrugged, not answering verbally, but Atticus leaned forward. "What did it say?" he asked. "I forget the exact wording," Cobb admitted, "but it was something like Heartland soldiers get a new life in Holdredge." Atticus blinked in confusion. "Holdredge?" he asked, the name not ringing a bell. "Had to look it up on a map," Harbin replied, "but it's a small town to the southeast of North Platte, in Nebraska." Atticus nodded thoughtfully. "Anybody you know of that took the bait?" he asked. "Not in our group, but knew a few guys who didn't make it to the train out of town," Cobb said, his voice low. "And nobody said anything?" the ex-ranger pressed. Cobb shook his head with a sigh. "Morale wasn't exactly that high at the time," he admitted. "First, we retreated. Then we all heard about or experienced the shit show in Kansas City, and now they were shipping us off to Seattle for a full-scale invasion. As far as we were concerned, it was every man for himself." "Every man for himself, huh?" Atticus echoed, pursing his lips. "We're loyal and did our duty," Harbin insisted, shoulders straightening. "Doesn't mean we didn't understand why others would want to cut bait and try to do something on their own." The ex-ranger nodded. "Fair enough," he replied, raising a palm as if to say no judgment. "Now, what did you see in North Platte?" "Nothing but a well-oiled machine," Harbin explained. "It was a skeleton crew, but they ran everything smoothly." "So, no signs of trouble?" Atticus asked. "No zombie army trying to knock down the gate?" Cobb shook his head, brow furrowing in confusion. "No, nothing like that at all," he replied, his tone clear that he didn't understand why the question was even being asked. "There was a cafeteria, bunks with relatively clean sheets. Train came in, we loaded up while they refueled, and then we were on our way." "Any of the ground crew come with you?" Atticus asked. Harbin shook his head. "No, and we didn't expect them to," he explained. "I was chatting up one of them while we were waiting to board. They said they were ordered to stay to maintain and defend the train yard." Atticus nodded slowly. "Did they say why?" he asked. "I got the sense that they didn't know why," Harbin admitted with a shrug. "My guess is that they wanted to keep transportation lines open with the civilian population in the region. But that's just a guess." "Solid guess," Atticus agreed. After a brief moment of quiet, Harbin cocked a brow. "What else can we help you with, sir?" he asked politely. "Do you have any maps of the area?" Atticus asked. "I'm going to be going in kind of blind, so anything would be of help." Harbin nodded and got up, moving over to a bag on the floor in the corner. He pulled out a couple of maps, one of Nebraska and one of Kansas. He moved back and spread them out on the coffee table. "All of our notes on there are a couple of weeks old," he admitted, "so not sure how much help they'll be." Atticus leaned over, looking over the markings. Several towns had circles around them with notes off to the side, along with some solid lines drawn on major roads with roadblock scrawled next to them. "I really appreciate it, boys," he said sincerely, raising his gaze to the soldiers. "Hope your friend gets all healed up." Harbin nodded. "Appreciate that, sir," he said, then turned to Linda. "Ma'am, do we need to get him ready to move?" She shook her head, raising a hand. "No, I let your people know he's still not good to go, so they said he can come back on the next transport in a week or so," she assured him. Harbin smiled, looking relieved. "Really appreciate that," he replied. "And if there's anything we can do to help around town, please let us know." Her return smile was a bit tight. I'll think about it and let you know," she replied. Harbin nodded as Atticus gathered up the maps and plonked his hat back on his head. The soldier stood as they did, moving to escort them out of the house. "If you need anything else, sir, just let me know," he said. "Appreciate that, soldier," Atticus replied with a tip of his hat. He and Linda left,
heading back to the street.
"So, what now?" Linda asked. "Should we get Bill?"
The ex-ranger shook his head. "No, I need time to go over these," he said, flicking the maps in his hands. "Is there someplace warm we can hole up?" She nodded.
"Got an office with a wood-burning fireplace in it," she said. "Should be nice and toasty, if that works."
He grinned. "Music to my ears," he drawled. "Lead the way." Chapter 3. Atticus pored over the maps with a magnifying glass that Linda had procured for him. He scribbled notes on his notepad, as he had been for the last hour or so. Linda sat by the fire, a soft-cover book in her hand, though she occasionally glanced over at the hard-working man. He hadn't stopped or said anything since he'd sat down at the desk. A soft knock at the door interrupted their quiet atmosphere, and Linda slid a bookmark into her book, closing it and setting it on her lap.
"It's open," she called.
Bill entered, shivering a bit and rubbing his eyes, looking a bit groggy.
"There you are,"
he said as he approached Atticus.
"Thought you left without me."
"I'm a lot of things, Bill, but a train operator's not among them," the ex-ranger said good-naturedly. "You get a good nap in?" Bill yawned, covering his mouth at the last second as if he hadn't realized it was happening.
"One of those sleeps where you wake up and forget where you are," he admitted. "Granted, that's a common occurrence when I drink, but feels weird after a normal nap."
Atticus chuckled. "Don't worry, I'm keeping an eye out for the good stuff for you," he said.
"So, you ready to roll out?" the engineer asked. "We're burning daylight."
"Just about," Atticus said. "I need your expertise before we can take off." He waved the man over, and Bill approached, looking down and letting out an impressed whistle.
"Somebody's been working hard while I slept," he commended as he leaned over the desk. "You should have gotten me up sooner."
Atticus shook his head. "Didn't need you before now," he said.
"So, what do you need?" Bill asked.
The ex-ranger pointed to the map as he spoke, running his fingers along the lines. "So, I've tracked our path from here to North Platte, and I'm pretty sure I've found our stopping place," he said, "but not sure how it lines up with the rails."
"Okay, what did you find?" Bill asked.
"Little town called Oshkosh," Atticus said, tapping his finger on it. "Looks like it runs right along Highway 26, which isn't quite a direct shot into North Platte, but close enough."
Bill nodded slowly. "You're good. That was going to be one of my suggested stops for you," he said.
"So the tracks are near it?" Atticus asked.
"Runs right through the heart of town, actually," Bill explained.
The ex-ranger chuckled. "You got one hell of a memory there," he said. "All the thousands of miles you've traveled, and you remember that one tiny town?"
Bill laughed. "I wish I was that good," he admitted. "I knew a guy from there, so when we went through it, the name stuck with me."
Atticus playfully wiped his brow. "Phew! For a second there I thought I had to contend with a super genius," he joked.
They shared a laugh, and Linda stood up from her chair, setting her book gently down on it. "Before you two venture off into the great unknown, what can I get you?" she asked. "We don't have much in the way of weapons, but I have a pretty well-stocked tool shed if something there suits your fancy."
"I'm pretty good on weapons," Atticus said, patting his holster. "But I wouldn't turn down another one of those fresh-baked loaves of bread."
Linda chuckled. "I think that can be arranged," she said with a smile. "I'll see if I can scare you up a cup of coffee, too."
Bill held up a finger.
"If you could manage to come across, too, I wouldn't be heartbroken," he added with a hopeful smile. "You got it, Bill," she replied, and left the room, leaving the two men standing over the maps. "I gotta tell you, every time I've been through Oshkosh, I've smacked into a few of those things that wandered out onto the tracks," the engineer said, back to business.
"Full infestation?"
Atticus asked.
Bill nodded slowly.
"Pretty sure," he said. "Of course, that's probably going to be the story in every one of these small towns."
"That's what I figured," Atticus said.
"I will say that when I was rolling through, I did see a fair amount of vehicles," the engineer added. "If there were locals there, they didn't make some big escape."
"Just need one that still runs and has gas," Atticus mused.
"Sorry I can't take you closer, but—"
Bill trailed off with a wince. I'm a lot more expendable than you are, Atticus finished. The engineer wrinkled his nose sheepishly. I wasn't trying to say that, he said. Atticus laughed, clapping him on the shoulder. Never be afraid of speaking the truth, he said. Unless there's a pretty girl around, then, by all means, lie your ass off if it makes me sound better. They shared a hearty laugh, and Bill shook his head. If you survive this, we're going for drinks, he said, pointing a finger at his new friend. Absolutely, Atticus agreed, and they shook on it, turning back to the desk as they awaited the return of their goodies for the road. Chapter 4. Atticus stood in his train car as it rumbled down the tracks. They were going quite fast, and it took a little effort for him to get the motion of the rocking down so he could work. He dug through his bag, checking the ammunition on his revolver, testing each click on the chamber to make sure it was working smoothly, before holstering it. He broke out his backup handgun, checking the ammunition and stashing it in his rear belt holster. He pulled out his knife, unsheathing it and inspecting it. The blade was clean and shiny, something that was unlikely to be the case by the end of the day. He put it up and slid it through his belt loop. Up next was a hunting shotgun. He checked every inch of it before clearing the chamber. He inspected it, then loaded it up to maximum capacity, which was 5 on this particular model. He grabbed a handful of shells and lined them in his holster, carrying another dozen with him. Finally, there was an assault rifle with a scope. It wasn't his favorite weapon, but one he knew he needed to have on him. He checked it out to make sure it was operational, before slamming the magazine back in and chambering around. He put the only reserve magazine he had in his front shirt pocket, giving it a tap for luck. He laid both long guns on the table before taking a seat, looking out the window and letting his mind wander for a brief moment, just enjoying the scenery, which was now mostly snow-free. The train finally began to slow down, not dramatically, but enough to let him know that they were almost at the stop. He snapped out of the leisurely mindset and shook himself into game mode. Okay, Atticus, he said to himself as he shook out his arms. You better get your mind right, because this isn't the easy strolls you've had up to this point. Once you step off this train, you're on your own behind enemy lines, for all intents and purposes. If you're lucky, it's just an army of ghouls. If you're unlucky, it's the literal army. And there's a good chance they aren't going to be happy to see you. The train continued to slow down, the brakes hitting the wheels sending a screeching metallic sound through the air. He continued to sit there, deep in thought, focusing on the mission before him. Finally, the train stopped, and he looked around at nothing but empty wasteland around them. Attention passengers, Bill's voice came over the intercom. We have reached our final destination, which is the middle of nowhere. Well, not really the middle, more like a mile away from civilization. But still, just looking around feels like the middle of nowhere. When you depart, please make your way to the front of the train. Atticus took a big, deep breath as he got up and slung both the shotgun and assault rifle over his shoulder. He opened the door, the brisk air hitting him in the face again, but he paid it no mind. Before he stepped off, he reached over to the food cart, grabbing a bottle of water and putting it into his back pocket. He hopped off the train and marched towards the front like a man on a mission. As he moved, he looked up as Bill hung his head out the front window of the engine. The engineer let out a whistle. Someone really ought to get you on film, he drawled, because you got that swagger thing down. The walk, the boots, the hat, the small arsenal strapped to you. I'd run if I saw you headed my way. Let's hope any would-be attackers feel the same way, Atticus quipped, tipping his hat. So, what's your plan? Bill asked, leaning on the window casually. Atticus tilted his head towards the front of the train. Gonna walk right into Oshkosh over there, avoid trouble, and find me a ride to North Platte, he said. You have a time frame yet? Bill asked. The ex-ranger shook his head. At least a day, he said. Shouldn't take you that long to get to North Platte and back, Bill said slowly. I know, Atticus replied, and pulled out his notebook, holding it up and wiggling it. Depending on what I find there, I have one more town to check out. Got a lead? Bill asked. Atticus shrugged and shook his head. Just a hunch, he admitted. I realize that I just met you, the engineer said, but I get the sense that when you get hunches, shit goes down. Atticus chuckled. Just my gift, I suppose, he said. It's a shame you didn't get a receipt to return it, Bill quipped. Atticus chuckled, shaking his head. Okay, I'll be back here in 24 hours, Bill declared. I'll have enough to keep me occupied for another 48 once I'm here. After that, I'm going to have to turn back and head for home. If I'm gone longer than 72 hours, assume I'm not coming back, the ex-ranger replied solemnly. Or I found my own way. You'll be all right, Bill said, but he sounded like he was trying to inject confidence into his voice. In this world, there were too many uncertainties, too many wild cards, too many unexpected deaths on top of the expected ones. If I'm not, I need you to do me a favor, Atticus said firmly. The engineer nodded, not even bothering to argue. Name it, he said. My bag is in your travel car, Atticus said, jerking a thumb over his shoulder. I need you to get it to my girl and her caretaker Evelyn. Tell them that I got what my clients were looking for. That way they can get paid and have plenty of rations. Bill nodded firmly. Consider it done, he declared. But I'd consider it a personal favor if you'd come back alive so I don't have to go breaking a little girl's heart. Atticus smiled, extending his hand. I'll do my best, he promised. He didn't want to go breaking his little girl's heart either. Bill shook with him and gave him a thumbs up, and began to back up the train as Atticus began his march towards Oshkosh. Behind him, the train picked up speed, and he forced himself not to look back, keeping his focus on the future. He could make out the outlines of a few buildings on the horizon, the small town about a mile away. Even though they were faint, he could already see tiny slivers of movement on the streets. Okay, he said out loud to himself. Let's get this show on the road. Chapter 5. Atticus walked towards the town on the tracks, strolling along like a man on a mission. With each step, the buildings got a little bit bigger, and the movement within the town became a little more noticeable. Much to his chagrin, there was a lot of movement. Entire areas of the road were covered from the packs of ghouls roaming around. It didn't appear as though they were going after anything in particular, at least just normal shambling about. That meant that there probably wasn't anything alive there to hold their attention, though he knew he still needed to be on his guard. He was about a half a mile from town before he pulled out his scoped assault rifle. He looked through it, scanning the town, hoping to see something of value. Disappointment settled in his gut when he found absolutely nothing. The train tracks cut straight through the heart of downtown, and it was packed tight with ghouls and no vehicles in sight. He scanned the entire town, looking to either side, hoping that there would be something with wheels. It was a stretch to think he'd find one with fuel and keys, but at the very least there had to be a vehicle first before he could start hoping about that. Guess I'm going to the outskirts, he huffed to himself, lowering the rifle with a sigh. He walked diagonally off of the tracks, away from them, and towards the town at an angle. He made it another quarter-mile up towards the town before moving to walk parallel to the tracks. He moved carefully and quietly, stopping at every intersection and looking ahead with his scope for trouble. He pursed his lips at the sight of the next 3 roads. It was the same story with each one. Tons of zombies, but nothing resembling a usable vehicle. If there were any in there, he couldn't see them through the masses of ghouls. He continued on his way, going around the town but making sure to keep his distance, not wanting to get the attention of anything inside. It took him a good 20 minutes of hiking, with constant checking to see if there was an opening. Finally, he spotted the outskirts of a neighborhood. He pulled out his scope and started scanning, finding a smattering of ghouls, but more importantly, vehicles. Finally. "There we go," he murmured, continuing his scan. He focused on a house that was right on the edge of town, with an old 4x4 behemoth of a truck sitting in the driveway. It even had a lift kit, so plowing through zombies would be easier, and big tires to push through any trouble he found. He nodded to himself and slung the rifle over his shoulder, strolling towards the neighborhood. It looked like it might have been peaceful once. A quaint little suburbia nestled in the small town with houses that were similar in size, but not in style. As he got closer to the house, he noted the half-dozen zombies within 30 yards of it, none of which had noticed him as of yet. Atticus drew his knife, continuing to stroll. When he reached the edge of the yard, one of the creatures finally took notice, turning and shambling in his direction. He stepped forward and stabbed it in the head, catching the corpse as it fell and leaving it in the grass to avoid making extra noise. 2 more ghouls turned towards him, reaching out and opening their mouths with excitement at the sight of the fresh meal. But he had plenty of time. Instead of waiting and taking them out, he moved away from the zombies and around the back of the house, where the coast was clear. He made it to the back door and punched his knife handle through the small pane of glass by the knob. He peered inside for a beat to make sure nothing was going to bite off his limb, spotting movement coming from the living room. It was still several yards away and seemed to be having issues navigating the furniture. He thought for a moment, but shook his head. "That ride is pretty sweet," he thought. "Just do it." He reached inside and quickly unlocked the door, retrieving his hand and slipping into the house. He slid the deadbolt into place behind him to secure the door and whirled around to face a ghoul that had come out of nowhere. Atticus didn't have time to get his knife up, so he ducked under the grab attempt and flung his arms towards the creature. He managed to shove it towards the wall, and it slammed hard against the drywall, unable to peel itself off before Atticus leapt forward and shoved his knife into its eye socket. He turned towards a trio of zombies coming in from the living room, looking very much like a family that had perished together. The one he'd already killed had been a large male, and these 3 looked like they had once been an elderly woman and her 2 teenage boys. Atticus looked around the immediate area, spotting a kitchen table to his right and a counter to the left. He waited until the last second before darting towards the counter, vaulting over it and landing hard on the ground on the other side, losing his hat in the process. He quickly popped up, encouraging the ghouls to cluster on the other side instead of skirting the counter to get to him. He fought through the flailing arms, taking down the shortest of the creatures with a quick jab to the head. His knife didn't dislodge from the skull fast enough, however, and as the ghoul fell to the ground, the knife handle slipped from Atticus's hand, the blade falling to the ground still lodged in its victim. He looked around the kitchen for another weapon as one of the creatures wised up and began staggering around the counter towards him. He spotted a cast-iron pan on the stove and darted over to grab it. He picked it up and tested the weight in his hands, realizing it was authentic and heavy as hell. He swung hard, catching the ghoul in the side of the head with such force that it knocked the monster clear off of its feet. He turned the pan sideways and slammed it down into the zombie's face a few times, completely obliterating its head to make sure the job was finished before turning to the last remaining ghoul. It was still trying to walk through the counter, gnashing its teeth hungrily and reaching for him. He regrouped, taking a breath because he knew he had time. He picked his hat up off of the ground, dusting it off and plonking it back firmly on his head. He stood there for a moment, staring at the frail-looking old woman with bite marks all over her body. His mind wandered without his consent, unable to keep from imagining how horrible this must have been for her. Her family turning into monsters and attacking her, horrifically ending her life before turning her into one of them. How terrifying that must have been. He took a deep breath and shook it off, raising his pan and stepping forward, putting all of his strength into the swing. With one forceful smack, he decapitated her, ending her miserable existence. He tossed the pan down and walked around and reclaimed his knife from the other corpse. He raised it and moved quickly and carefully through the house, doing a sweep to make sure he'd taken down all the threats. He was relieved to find the rest of the rooms empty. "Okay, now just need the keys," he murmured, and worked his way back through the house, looking everywhere he could think of. Every surface, every desk drawer, every hook on the wall, but he couldn't find a single keyring. He ripped the house to shreds for 15 minutes with no luck, finding himself back in the kitchen, lips pursed in thought. Maybe the bodies? He thought and turned around, giving the corpses a pat down. He even checked the grandmother's robes, despite her looking far too old to have been safely driving. Nothing. He grunted in frustration before standing up, and he spotted a family portrait on the wall that caught his eye. He walked over and inspected it, realizing that there were 5 people in it. The father he'd taken out when he first came in the door, the 2 teenagers, the grandmother, and a woman, likely the mother of the 2 boys. "That would just be my luck," he said with a sigh. He moved to the front of the house, peeking out the window at the driveway. He looked over the SUV, spotting a definite blood splatter on the door, with a huge pool of crimson on the ground just beside it. Maybe the mother had run for the car and been attacked, dropping the keys. He pulled out his rifle, looking through the scope to inspect every inch of the ground and the lake of blood. He didn't see a single shine of keys anywhere. "Damn it," he muttered. "Looks like I have to move on." He looked through the neighborhood for another potential, finally spotting a truck kitty-corner to the house he was in. The only problem was that there were a couple dozen zombies between him and the next house. He took a deep breath, weighing his options for a moment. He moved to the back of the house and looked around, not just in the yard but back into the wooded area behind the house. There wasn't much in the way of zombie activity back there. He unlocked the door and dragged the zombies out of the path to it before heading back into the front door. He opened it up, taking his revolver out and aiming it at the closest ghoul. "Howdy," he said brightly, and pulled the trigger, ripping the zombie's head nearly clean off, and sending a boom echoing throughout the neighborhood. He stood there in the doorway, letting out a sharp whistle to keep the creatures focused on him. "Come on now. Get a move on. I have places to be." He watched the creatures get closer to the house, a few making it well before the others. He looked around and spotted a lightweight wooden chair near the door sitting at a desk. He grabbed it and stepped just outside the door, using it like a lion tamer at a circus. He jammed it underneath the arms of the lead zombie, using the creature as an undead roadblock, moving it back and forth to keep the others at bay for a few moments, so the others could catch up. Once there was a decently sized mob, with 15 of the couple dozen close to the door, Atticus shoved the creature and the chair to the side before going back into the house and leaving the door wide open. He strolled through the house to the back, making it out the door and moving quickly up the back side of the buildings on that side of the street as the creatures filed into the house behind him. He moved to the street, hanging loose at the corner of the house for several moments, watching the mob push and shove each other to get inside. He kept his eyes peeled to make sure his gunshot hadn't attracted any other attention, and it appeared it hadn't. While a few creatures were heading his way, none of them appeared to have gotten a good read on the sound, many of them looking around aimlessly for the source, and none of them were between him and the house. He broke from cover, strolling leisurely across the street like he owned the town. He walked up to the house, trying the front door and surprisingly finding it unlocked. He walked inside, knife at the ready, and closed the door behind him securely. Loud banging echoed from the back bedrooms, and he peered down the hallway, finding the doors shut, so it was nothing to worry about. Atticus headed into the kitchen and spotted a set of keys sitting on the counter. He picked them up, grinning at finally finding some luck, and shoved them in his pocket before rifling through the cupboards. His grin widened even further at what he found. "Fun part is going to be getting you home safely," he said as he reached in, picking up a sealed bottle of mid-range whiskey. "Not the top-shelf stuff, but it'll do." He cradled the bottle in the crook of his arm, pulling the keys back out as he headed for the front door. He looked out the small window panes to make sure it was still clear out front, and when he found it safe, he slipped outside. He walked to the truck and opened the driver's side door, setting the whiskey and his long guns on the passenger seat before sliding behind the wheel. "Don't be rusty. Don't be rusty," he whispered as he put the key into the ignition, hoping beyond hope that his luck would continue. He turned the key, and it took a moment, but the engine rumbled to life. As it sputtered, several zombies began to pay attention and started shambling in his direction. He tapped the gas a few times to encourage the engine to run smoothly, and after a few moments, it finally started to purr. "Now we're talking," he declared, and shut the driver's side door before slamming the truck into gear and hitting the gas, peeling out of the driveway and heading down the street. There were a few zombies in his way, but he easily avoided them, not wanting to risk impact since this vehicle wasn't raised up nearly as much as the other one he'd wanted. He navigated the neighborhood and came up on the main part of town, where a throng of zombies milled about, shoulder to shoulder. He took side roads to the outskirts, navigating the dirt roads on the edge of town instead, not wanting to risk any zombies. Finally, he made it to the highway, pulling onto it and looking in the rearview mirror. There were a couple hundred creatures on the main stretch, all turning and shambling in his direction. "Don't worry, gang. You'll get another shot at me soon," he said. "Don't think it'll matter, though." He rolled down the window as he picked up speed, enjoying the cool air on his face. He settled in, enjoying the comfort, because it would be a bit of a haul to North Platte, and he had a feeling that he would miss the quiet. Chapter 6. Atticus took his time and drove cautiously, and after a few detours to get around zombie-infested small towns, it took a good hour and a half of driving to reach sight of North Platte. The sun was hanging high in the sky still, and the air was cool, and he was in good spirits. He was also very thankful to the previous owner of the truck, who had been kind enough to fill up the gas tank before the apocalypse happened, so that wouldn't be a worry at all that day. It had been a while since Atticus had been on the open road, and he was taking full advantage of it. His hand dangled out the window, and he let the wind pick it up and move it around playfully. He knew it might be a while before he got to do this again, and had vowed to enjoy himself. The good mood dampened when he spotted a sign reading, "North Platte, 3 miles. "Okay, game face time," he said to himself, and pulled off to the side of the road. He opened one of his maps, running his finger along it. The train yard was in the southern part of town, and he studied the notes scribbled along it. Detour it is. He traced his finger along the roads, picking the proper path through. Once satisfied with his decision, he popped back onto the road and drove off. It took several minutes to navigate his route, but soon he could see the train yard up ahead. He grabbed his rifle and got out of the truck, climbing up onto the roof and using the scope to survey the situation. Immediately, he found a problem: a handful of zombies in the train yard. It wasn't many, but still very out of place. "What the hell are you boys doing there?" he thought as he scanned. "This was supposed to be a secure area." He started on the left, where several train cars sat on one of the dozens of side tracks in the yard. There were several rows of tracks behind them, but he couldn't get a good read on them. To the far right was a raised tower, up about 20 yards in the air so it could overlook the entire compound. Past that, there was a large building in the distance at the back of the lot. That's gotta be the main office, he thought. So what do you think, Atticus? Want to get a bird's eye view, or just roll with it? Can't be too many of those things in the yard, can there? He doubted his own logic, and couldn't help but feel that he'd jinxed himself just by thinking that. Let's play it by ear, he told himself. Gotta take out those stragglers by the fence first anyway. He scanned a bit more until he found a pallet of rebar. Yeah, that'll do nicely. There wasn't a zombie within 50 yards of the pallet, so he figured it shouldn't be a problem getting to it. He looked towards the fence for a weak spot, seeing that the far left corner was loose. The fence was a good 8 feet tall with barbed wire at the top, which wasn't exactly conducive for climbing over. That's my way in, he thought, and slid down the hood of the truck. He put his rifle back into the passenger seat and hesitated for a moment before finally deciding to take his shotgun with him. Better safe than sorry. He shut the doors and locked them before walking over to the fence. Even though he was most likely alone, he wasn't taking any chances. The gun would be easy enough to replace, but he wasn't risking that whiskey. He made his way to the hole in the fence, staying low as he went to try and minimize his exposure to the zombies inside the yard. When he reached it, he took a moment to take stock of the situation before going through the hole. The rebar was about 20 yards straight ahead, with a couple of zombies between him and the weapon. After picking that up, it was a 50-yard wind sprint to the open train car door. It was high enough off of the ground that it would protect him from the creatures and allow him to pick off any coming after him. At least, that was the theory. Atticus nodded to himself and got to work, pulling back the fence and slipping inside the train yard. The chain links making just enough noise to draw the attention of one of the creatures near the rebar. As it shambled towards him, he darted forward quickly, jamming his knife through the side of its head and shoving it to the ground. The sound brought other nearby creatures towards him, but he easily took care of them, one with a stab through the eye socket and the other a jab to the top of the head, rotted enough that it was like butter. He walked to the rebar pile, quickly looking through it and finding a sturdy piece about 6 feet long. He inspected it to make sure it was strong, then lifted it, turning to face the coming mob. "All right, let's do this," he said, and started running. He veered away from the zombie horde in order to move towards the open train car door. There was only about 10 yards of clearance between him and the nearest creature once he got there, so he didn't hesitate. He shoved the rebar into the car and pulled himself up, rolling away from the door to put a safe distance between him and his attackers. Once inside, he quickly popped up to his feet, surveying the inside of the car to make sure he was alone. He was relieved to find he'd picked the right spot to make a stand. By the time he cleared the area, the first few creatures had come to the car, their chests pressing up against the floor, arms reaching inside to grasp at their potential dinner. "Looks like I'm drawing quite the crowd here," Atticus drawled, giving his adoring fans a bow before picking up the rebar and loosening his shoulders. "Don't want to disappoint my audience." He picked his first target. A tall zombie wearing a reflective vest, as if it were working construction when the end of the world had begun. Atticus stabbed down with the makeshift weapon, cracking through the creature's eye and into its brain. The corpse convulsed before falling back into the mob, parting the gathering and falling to the ground like a botched crowd surfing. "All right, that's one," Atticus said as the hole in the crowd quickly closed, more zombies stepping over their fallen friend to get to him. He repeated the process several more times, cracking through the soft skulls of the deceased with the rebar. It wasn't even sporting, more like shooting fish in a barrel, and more like a strenuous workout than fighting for his life. "Yeah, getting my reps in today," he huffed as he continued. It took a solid 5 minutes of gruesome work, but finally the mini-mob by the train car was dealt with, leaving a pile of corpses on the ground. Atticus tossed the rebar to the side, keeping it inside just in case he had to retreat to this position later. He rubbed his arms, sore and warm from the constant attacking. Okay, we're going to give that a minute to see if any of your friends want to join you, he said to the dead bodies. Then the real work begins. He looked around, figuring out how you got in here in the first place. Once he was convinced there weren't any others coming, Atticus hopped down from the car, making sure to keep his footing on the pile of corpses he'd left on the ground. As he walked to solid ground, he drew his knife, keeping it at the ready, just in case. He looked around the southern portion of the compound, not seeing much in the way of conflict. He looked up at the raised tower to the east. He debated with himself for a few moments before nodding. Yeah, do the bird's eye view, he thought. No sense in walking into any more trouble than you're already in. He hiked over to the raised tower, listening carefully for noise. In the distance, he could hear the shuffling of footsteps, as well as some light moaning. He took a knee, peering underneath the train cars. He could see a handful of feet, but they were spread out. Nothing close to the mob he'd struck down. Keep moving, he urged himself. They'll still be there when you're ready. He walked over to the raised tower, finding the stairs along the back side of it. He carefully moved up, staying at the ready in case of an attack. As he approached the top of the stairs, he reached a small office-like building with windows all the way around. He made sure he was the only one up there and began to investigate. He walked to the windows and cupped his hands around his eyes, looking inside. There wasn't much in there, no radio equipment, just some desks and chairs with one radio on the table. He went inside, looking around for anything out of the ordinary, but nothing jumped out at him. He went to the radio, flipping it on and off, and nothing. It was an older model, not any type he was familiar with. If they were in communication with Seattle, or someone else, I don't think they were doing it here, he thought. This looks like a relic from the past. Atticus went back outside, over to the railing that looked over the entire train yard. He let out a deep sigh when he saw what he was up against. Nothing's easy these days, he thought, shaking his head. There were multiple connected train cars on a couple dozen tracks, spread out with gaps in between them. However, of course, there were dozens of zombies milling about in the area. He looked around some more, finding the far west corner had a hole in the fence, a large one, along with a crater. It looked like something had been detonated there to open it up to the nearby ghouls. Now, who would go and do such a thing? He wondered. Was this an attack? He contemplated more as he looked around, spotting the main two-story office building in the northeast corner of the compound. There were a few dozen zombies around it, none of which appeared to be attempting to get inside. He looked back to the hole in the fence at the smattering of zombies wandering about, but it wasn't a steady stream. Okay, decision time, he thought, crossing his arms. That office building might have the answers you need, or it could be a wild goose chase. He pursed his lips, thinking hard, and looked back over to the mob of ghouls he would have to work through to get to the office building. Finally, he sighed. If this is a diversion, I need to know, he decided. Okay, man up and let's get it done. Atticus pulled himself away from the railing, heading back down the stairs towards the ground. He thought for a moment on the best way through, the debate raging in his head. You're good enough to sneak through, he thought. It'll be like that time down in El Paso. If those goons didn't spot you, then neither will these. But that was also 15 years ago before your knees made that cracking sound when the weather gets cold. Okay, maybe some violence is in order after all. When he reached the ground, he walked along the southern fence. He stopped several times along the way, pulling out his knife at the support beams of the fence and prying the chain links away in order to create multiple escape points for himself. Once he got that done, he turned back towards the trains. He knelt down, spotting some movement on the other side, but nothing that put any fear into him. Yeah, they're spread out pretty good, he thought. I should be all right moving up. Atticus walked along the west side of the yard, with the first set of train cars blocking his path about 70 yards up and over several side tracks. He knew that the hole in the fence that was blown open was directly ahead, but he couldn't see it from his vantage point. As he came up on the first row of cars, he ducked behind them for cover, peeking out to survey the situation. There were a few zombies down the row a bit, but none of them were paying him any attention. He knelt down, looking underneath the next train, but there were no feet in the immediate vicinity. He quickly moved across the tracks, ducking underneath the cars and scurrying forward, stopping at the edge. He looked around again, plotting his next move. There were zombies to the right and left, down about 30 yards each. Straight ahead sat another set of train cars, with a significant amount of movement on the other side. Well, there goes the underplan, he thought wryly, and looked to his right. There was a gap in the cars about 50 yards up, but the only problem was that it was through another batch of ghouls, with several more within reach. If you're going to do it, he thought, psyching himself up. That's the way. He convinced himself and burst from cover, not running but moving with purpose. He didn't worry about killing zombies, not wanting to slow himself down. He jumped in between the tracks as he went, hoping that some of the corpses would trip themselves up. He was in luck, and several of the zombies face-planted as they pursued him. He did have to shove a couple more out of the way to get to the gap between the cars, before quickly blowing through to the other side. He paused briefly at the edge to look out. To his right, there were dozens of zombies, most of which weren't looking in his direction, but within 50 yards all spread out. The closest at about 10 yards. To his left were a dozen or so spread out, with another opening about 30 yards up. He took the path of least resistance, running along the tracks. His boots on the wooden planks and gravel alerted a few ghouls, and he pushed through several of them, shoving them to the ground as he ran by. When he was within 10 yards of the opening, several zombies converged on it. He stopped, jamming his knife into a face to buy himself a few moments to think. The few creatures became a mob, 15 or so packing their way into the opening. Atticus stayed calm, not panicking as he looked around for another escape route. A ladder on the back of one of the train cars caught his eye, and without hesitation, he made a break for it. He sprinted and leapt onto the ladder, climbing up just as the outstretched, decrepit hands attempted to grab him, but they caught nothing but air. He made it to the top, taking a beat to gather himself and assess the situation. He looked down from the area where he'd just come from, and there was a full-blown mob, with more coming his way. He walked over to the other side of the train car, and his heart sank as he looked down and saw much the same on that side as well. Well, this is going swimmingly, he muttered. He looked towards the office building, which had one more set of train cars blocking it. That was about 100 yards to the east of him. He ran through various scenarios in his head before finally deciding on the riskiest. Atticus, my boy, you damn well better know what you're doing, he said to himself with a sigh, and drew his revolver. He looked towards the hole in the fence, still seeing only a smattering of ghouls standing near the entrance. He couldn't see too far past the opening, but he was hopeful that there weren't too many others that would be attracted by what he was about to do. Here goes nothing, he huffed, and aimed his gun down at the mob, firing off a couple of quick shots. The booming sound echoed against the metal cars, and within seconds, every zombie in the yard shambled his way. He reloaded the 2 rounds he'd just fired off as he waited for them to get close to him. Yeah, that's right. Come to Daddy, he barked. Atticus looked over to the opening, seeing a steady stream of ghouls coming in, but not the swarm he was afraid of. He looked back towards the building, seeing that the zombies on the final aisle were coming his way and leaving a big gap for him to cross. Once they were close enough and packed in with the other creatures, he turned and took off running along the top of the train cars. He leapt over the gaps and kept his momentum going as he ran 100 yards or so down the yard, leaving the mob in the dust. He quickly shimmied down the ladder on a car and hit the ground, ducking underneath the final row of cars and reaching the building. There were windows all around the walls, but from what he could see, there wasn't any movement inside. He made his way to the door, pulling on it and finding it unlocked, much to his surprise. Now that's odd, he thought, and entered cautiously. He flipped the deadbolt lock behind him to secure the door and took cover in the darkness inside, staying away from the windows and hoping he didn't bring any creatures back his way. He worked carefully through the first floor of the building, staying low amongst the cubicle walls, occasionally popping up to look around for trouble. Much to his surprise, he didn't find a single zombie on the first floor. Atticus looked around for the stairwell door, spotting it on the far wall. He moved towards it, looking around for anything out of the ordinary. From what he could tell, everything there was just normal office stuff. There were lots of papers on desks, maps on the wall focused on the northwest, which made sense because of the invasion. He made it to the stairwell, pulling the door open and going inside, drawing his revolver just before he did. The stairwell was dark as he peeked inside, pulling out a flashlight to illuminate it before going inside. He started working his way up the stairs to the second floor, hearing sounds of movement up ahead. Atticus made it to the door, stopping and gently pulling it open a crack, cutting his flashlight off to prevent him from being seen. As he looked down the large main aisle of the floor, he saw movement, and lots of it. There were 15 to 20 zombies all moving about in the main aisle and throughout the cubicles. He gently shut the door behind him. But before he began to move back downstairs, he paused, turning back to the door. Something's off, he thought, and gently opened the door again, making sure to stay silent. He looked closely at the zombies. They weren't in military clothes, and beyond that, they weren't even those who one would typically find in the military. There were a handful of younger ghouls, some well past their prime, and some that were grossly overweight. All of them were in civilian clothing, with only about 2/3 of them brandishing visible bite marks. Okay, work through it, he thought as he studied them. The downstairs is clean, but this floor has a whole mess of those creatures, so they either all figured out how to work the doors and open it up towards them, or somebody's trying to cover their tracks. Figured if somebody came looking that they'd find the rail yard overrun, but if they did get this far, they'd give up when they saw this mess. They didn't count on me, though. He chewed over this, looking through the door, trying to figure out his best plan of attack. Too many to take out with a knife, he thought. Going to have to risk the noise. But what to do? What to do? Atticus looked back into the office, down the aisle, and plotted his course. There were a few creatures bunched together about 10 yards away from the door, with the rest of them scattered about throughout the office. There was a small office on the wall to his right, with a wooden door and a glass panel. He nodded to himself. That's the play, he thought. Get them over there and let the shotgun do its thing. He drew his revolver, taking a few steadying breaths before getting to work. He casually walked through the door, letting it slam shut behind him. The noise immediately drew the attention of several of the ghouls in the room, and they started shambling his way. He walked right up to the first one, cocking the hammer back and pulling the trigger with the barrel a few inches away from its head. The entire center of the skull vanished in a spectacular display of blood and brains. "I'm here," he bellowed. "Let's have some fun." The gunshot was enough to garner the attention of every creature in the room, and they moaned with excitement and anticipation. Atticus cocked the hammer back as he walked along the wall. He took aim at a couple of zombies in front of him, unloading a couple of quick shots to take them both down. As he walked, he glanced into neighboring offices, making sure there weren't any unwelcome surprises. He fired off one more shot at a creature right by the door of the office he wanted to go to, which was in the center of the cubicle farm. He picked this one because there were only a few yards from the door to the nearest cube, making it all but impossible for the ghouls to get up enough pressure to break it down. Atticus hurried inside, shutting the door behind him while doing a quick sweep of the room, which was clear. He turned back to the door, seeing that a few creatures were already pressing up against it. "Yeah, that's right. Come and see me," he called, leaning back on the desk and taking a bit of a seat as he casually reloaded his revolver. He was completely unconcerned about the throng of ghouls now amassing outside the office. Once he had reloaded, he looked up, barely able to see outside through the rotting bodies taking up the view.
"All right, time to go to work," he said, and took the shotgun from his shoulder, checking it quickly before taking aim. He stood a couple of yards away from the glass, aiming it at the creature in the center, looking past it at several more pressed up against its back. Atticus steadied himself and pulled the trigger. The slug ripped through the glass and into the first creature's head with such velocity that it went through the next few zombies. 2 took wounds to the head, and a taller one behind them was hit in the throat. The damage was so severe that its head fell back, dangling for a moment before completely dropping to the ground.
"Huh," the ex-ranger said with awe. "That's a first."
He didn't stop to admire his handiwork for very long, however, as more creatures stepped up to fill the void. He aimed at the next group, getting similar results from the shot. He continued this several more times, exhausting the loaded ammo in the shotgun. He approached the door, looking out at the half a dozen or so zombies left. They seemed to be having trouble getting to the door thanks to the mass of rotted flesh on the ground. He drew his handgun from his back holster, popping them off one at a time, and quickly taking the remaining stragglers down. After several moments, the room finally fell silent. Atticus came out of the office, treading carefully just in case one of the slugs didn't finish the job. Sounds of gnashing teeth were muffled beneath the bodies, but it appeared they were at the bottom of the pile. He stepped over to solid ground, walking away from the heap of corpses. He kept his head on a swivel, still hearing movement from inside the office. He found a lone creature caught up in a cubicle, attracted by the noise but not smart enough to find the exit. He walked over to it, pulling out his knife and ending its undead existence with a single, well-placed jab. With the room clear, he walked over to the windows, some of which had damage from the rounds being fired. He looked out over the train yard. The zombies down there were agitated from the noise, but they weren't all gathering in a single location. It was as if they'd heard the noises but couldn't quite figure out exactly where they were coming from.
"Still, don't want to linger here any longer than absolutely necessary," Atticus said under his breath.
He turned around and set to investigating, trying to find something out of place.
Comms. Where are the comms at?
He walked along the outer offices, looking for the communications room. Those were the guys who were the last out, and the ones who had unexpectedly gone silent. It took a bit of hunting before he found the room in the far corner. He peered through the glass, shining his flashlight into the darkened room, spotting the communication equipment along the walls, with maps up above. As he scanned, he spotted a red splatter along some of the equipment and across the wall. He opened the door, finding a lone man in the room, laying face down in a pool of blood. He wore military fatigues and didn't appear to have any bite marks on him. Atticus gently rolled the body over to inspect it. There were definitely no bite marks anywhere, and the decomposition was no more than a few days in his estimation.
Well, he definitely wasn't one of those things when he took a shot to the head, he thought, and looked a little closer.
Half of the man's face was missing from the exit wound. Atticus inspected it before shaking his head.
So, a soldier in the middle of a secure location takes a bullet to the back of the head while in his office.
He stood up, looking around, not finding a handgun or any other weapon.
No gun either, so definitely not a suicide either.
He stood there for a moment, leaning up against one of the desks as he surveyed the walls. There was an empty space right in the middle of a collection of maps, and he approached it, looking at the pushpin still there. He pulled one out slightly, revealing a small corner of paper that had been torn off.
Looks like someone grabbed themselves a map and got out of here in a hurry, he mused quietly.
He glanced back at the body.
So, what happened to you, my friend? What happened to you?
He chewed over his thoughts for a moment, playing through different scenarios in his head, weighing them before he decided on the most plausible.
What if, he thought, what if there was a group who wanted to cut bait and defect? This poor guy is loyal and not on board with it. What choice do you have besides putting him down? Sure, you could let him go, but he'll report what is going on. and I can't imagine this group is real keen on being found, especially if they're not that big or established. He studied the wall, nodding to himself as he continued his line of thinking. Best working theory I got, he decided. At the very least, I know something bad went down here. I just don't know what exactly. He pulled out his notebook and jotted down a few things before stepping up to one of the maps. He looked in his notebook and traced his finger on the map to the south, tapping a small blip of a town called Wellfleet. He looked at his watch, noting it was late in the afternoon. Okay, got a couple hours of sun left, he murmured. Should have time to get down there, see if there's anything to see, and figure out the next move. If there's nothing, find a place to crash for the night and head home. If there is something... He contemplated for a moment before shaking his head. First things first, see if you find anything, he thought firmly. As if on cue, the moans grew louder outside, catching his attention. Okay, really, first things first, getting out of this building. He moved over to the windows, looking down. The crowd had apparently decided something of interest was in the building, so they were congregating in front of it. They were spread out pretty thin, creating a bit of a wall. Atticus thought for a moment before walking over to the far end of the building, the opposite side from where he'd come in, on the first floor. He looked down at a small contingent of creatures there, with a few more in the distance coming his way. He could see the hole in the fence in the distance, but there wasn't much activity there. Time to run the old okey doke, he said, and walked over to a cubicle, grabbing a heavy office chair and rolling it over to the window. He gave it a couple of taps before pulling out his revolver and firing a shot at the bottom corner. The glass spiderwebbed all the way through, and he grabbed the chair, throwing it as hard as he could towards the window. The weakened glass gave way under the force of the throw, shattering it into 1,000 pieces as the chair fell to the ground below. He looked out, letting out a loud whistle and yelling at the ghouls below. Yeah, come on over here, he bellowed. I'll be right down. He stood in the window for several moments, watching as the mob below shambled towards him, growing in strength just below his position. He looked towards the other side of the building, waiting as the creatures shambled away from it. Okay, just gotta give it a few more moments, and I'll... The sound of glass shattering cut off his thought, and he looked down in a panic as creatures poured into the building. Shit, he muttered, and turned, taking off running for the stairwell and drawing his revolver as he went. He burst through the door and leapt down the stairs, taking several at a time. He didn't hesitate when he got to the bottom, thundering through and into the main office area. To his right, creatures were breaking into the building, and the sound of the stairwell door slamming got their attention. But Atticus didn't remain stationary for them, taking off running towards the door he'd entered through. He was relieved to see there were no zombies there, thankfully drawn away by his noise from upstairs. He flung open the deadbolt and rushed into the train yard. Moans echoed from the other side of the building, all of them pushing to get inside. He quickly moved over to the nearest train, ducking underneath and slipping beneath it, pausing briefly to make sure the coast was clear. He repeated his maneuver several times as he moved down the train yard, not encountering any resistance as all the zombies in the area were now focused on the noise at the office building. Eventually he worked his way back to the truck, unlocking it and sitting inside for a moment, breathing a sigh of relief. What he'd just done had been risky, but the move had paid off a ton with the information he'd gotten. Atticus pulled out the map, figuring out where he was and where he needed to go. He started up the vehicle, rolling down the window to get a bit of a breeze going before popping it into gear. Next stop, he said as he hit the gas. Wellfleet. Chapter 7. The drive to Wellfleet was a pleasant one, with mostly open road and no zombies to deal with. The only thing of note in the last half hour had been an unusually large number of military vehicles that had been discarded on the side of the road. Atticus assumed it was because they were out of fuel. He considered stepping out to investigate some of the transport trucks, seeing if anything of value had been left behind. but he ultimately decided against it as he thought more about the deserters. If there is a desertion army, this was probably one of the first places they hit, he thought. Hell, some of the deserters were probably in these caravans. Honestly, can't blame them for cutting bait. If the military can't even get them fuel to get to the transports, then what hope was there to succeed in an invasion? He continued driving as the sun hung lower in the sky. There was only about an hour or an hour and a half left of daylight, and he wanted to make it count. He perked up when he spotted the sign boasting Wellfleet, 2 miles. Only 2 more miles, he thought. Should probably be safe about it. When he was within half a mile of town, he pulled off to the side of the road. He got out, using the scope on his rifle to survey the area. As he slowly moved his gaze across the horizon, he looked closely at the town, if one could even call it that. There wasn't much of a downtown area, just a couple of buildings with a few houses surrounding it. He took his time, wanting to make sure he wasn't walking into something he would rather not walk into. He didn't see anything, no movement or any signs of life. Okay, let's go check it out, he murmured, and hopped back into the truck. He drove into town, creeping along the road, looking around for anything, but finding nothing. He pulled off of the road behind the town hall and shut off the truck. He got out, leaving his long guns inside, and took a stroll around town. As he came around the front of the building, he noticed a couple of shattered windows on the front. He moved closer to investigate, finding several panes had been shattered with the glass breaking inwards. He inspected the walls around it, finding them peppered with bullets. Atticus pulled out his flashlight, shining it into the building. It didn't take long for him to spot a dead body on the ground. He tried the door, finding it unlocked, and he stepped inside to inspect the area. He knelt and flipped over the corpse, finding no signs that it had been a zombie. The middle-aged man was dressed in civilian hunting gear and had a single bullet wound to the chest. "Hit you right in the heart," the ex-ranger said. "At least you went quick." He looked around on the floor, finding a large collection of brass shells. "But what were you shooting at?" He stood up, heading back to the window and looking at the road. There weren't any corpses, zombie or otherwise, that he could see. He did spot another building across the way that was also missing some windows, so he headed out to investigate. Once again, the glass was shattered inwards. His flashlight illuminated the situation, and while there were no corpses, there were blood splatters on the wall. He moved inside and looked around, finding the blood streaks along the wall towards a back room. He opened the door, finding a room filled with boxes, along with a ton of blood and a military jacket. He picked it up, finding more blood and a bullet hole in the shoulder. "That must have hurt like a son of a bitch," he said, and dropped it back to the floor. He rifled through the boxes, finding civilian emergency rations. There weren't a lot of boxes, maybe 15 or 20, but it would be a decent haul for a small group. So, the military got into a firefight with some civilians, with this being the prize, he thought. Am I reading this right? He pursed his lips, thinking it through, not sure of what to make of it. Why would this be stored here? Surely this would have been taken by now, wouldn't it? He drummed his fingers on his thigh as he continued to work the problem. Maybe one of their transport trucks was running out of fuel, so they stashed it here. He ran scenarios in his head for a minute, not sure if he liked any of the ideas. He stepped out of the room, heading off to investigate some of the others. He opened the door to an office, finding papers and other desk decor brushed onto the floor. The only thing left on the desk was a single box of the rations. In the next office, the situation was similar, with the desk chair overturned and all the items from the top scattered across the floor. This one, however, didn't have a box in it. Okay, working theory, Atticus thought. Military stashed some rations here when fuel was getting low on the transports. Either the civilians or the deserters found it first and was willing to kill to keep it. He sighed, shaking his head. That's thin, Atticus, real thin. But you've had thinner pan out. As he debated with himself, the sound of a vehicle roared outside, screeching to a stop. He froze, listening hard, waiting for the sound of several doors slamming shut. At least 3, maybe 4, he thought, and moved to the door, shutting it nearly all the way, leaving only a crack so he could look out from the darkness down the hallway towards the front of the building. He reached into his back holster, pulling out his handgun. It wasn't nearly as powerful as his revolver, but more bullets and a faster fire rate was his concern now. If these weren't friendlies, he was going to need every advantage he could get. Voices carried down the hallway, echoing through the emptiness. He couldn't see who was talking, but the voices were male. "I'm getting real sick of this fetching bullshit," one of them whined. "Yeah, well, you fetching like a good little puppy is what's going to keep you fed this winter," another snapped. "So shut your yap." Finally they came into view. 3 men in military fatigues with heavy jackets. The first man stopped at the first door with all the boxes, opening it up and grinning. "Now we're talking," he said. "Start clearing this one out. I'll see what's left in the other rooms." He waved a hand around his head, and the other 2 men entered the storage room. Atticus slowly and quietly moved away from the door, getting behind it for cover as the leader sauntered down the hallway. He opened the first office and grunted. "Son of a whore," he called. "There's only a couple of boxes in this room. Somebody's been clearing the place." "Maybe it's just that room," one of the other men called back. "Yeah, I'll check," the leader said. Atticus gripped his handgun tightly, aiming it at chest level through the door as the footsteps got louder and closer. The door began to creep open, and the light from a flashlight moved across the room. The door was mere inches away from Atticus, who had his handgun pointed towards the deserter. Luckily, the man didn't open the door further or come inside, just looked around the room before hollering back to his friends. "Damn it, ain't nothing in here," he cried. "Good. Then why don't you get your fat ass over here and help us carry this stuff?" one of the other men huffed. "Benefits of being the supervisor," the leader sing-songed back. "You 2 do the heavy lifting, and I figure out where we're going next." One of his companions sighed loudly. "You mean this isn't the last stop?" he whined. "Nope. Got one more today," the leader replied. "Some little shitbird called Wallace about 30 minutes away." 20 with the way you drive," the other one muttered. "Oh, I can haul ass if you want," the leader said with a barking laugh. "Last time I did that, though, you nearly shit yourself." "Because you hit a patch of ice and we started skidding," the other man cried. The leader scoffed. "I had it under control," he insisted. "Now enough chit-chat. Get that stuff loaded. I want to be done before the sun goes down." He walked away from the door, and Atticus breathed a silent sigh of relief. He listened to the voices muffling inside the office with all the boxes, rising and falling as they loaded up their truck outside. He finally moved to the other side of the door, peeking out from the shadows. He didn't see anybody, and finally heard the door slam shut on the vehicle. A moment later, it roared to life and took off with a squeal of tires. Just to be safe, Atticus waited a few moments, wanting to make sure they hadn't forgotten anything, and come back. When it was clear they were gone, he came out of hiding and walked down the hallway. He inspected the storage room as he went, finding the only thing left was the bloody jacket. "Guess they weren't too broken up by their friend," he muttered. He headed back outside, taking a quick peek to make sure nothing was waiting for him. When he was sure it was clear, he went over to his truck, breaking out the map and finding Wallace, which was west along the highway. "Straight shot over to it," he thought. "What do you think, Atticus? Is it worth the risk?" He stood there and thought for a moment, going back to looking at the map. It was a long stretch of highway with no real places to pull off and hide. Before deciding, he leaned into the truck to check the fuel. There was half a tank of gas left. "Worst case, I can always hit the gas and outrun them," he thought. "They're going to be loaded down with all these boxes. Slow them down a bit." He chewed over that for a moment before finally nodding. "Okay, what the hell? Let's go see what they're up to." He got back into the truck, firing it up and heading out in pursuit of the deserters. He drove at a reasonable speed, not wanting to run the risk of them spotting him in the rearview mirror. Chapter 8. Atticus drove towards the town of Wallace, not sure of what to expect. He kept it slow, his eyes trained on the horizon for any sign of movement coming his way. Finally, the outskirts of town came into view, and he pulled off the road. He took out his rifle and started to scan the area, looking for the vehicle before moving any closer. It took him several moments, but he finally located it on the north side of town. "There you are," he whispered to himself. He continued to watch the vehicle, expecting to see them loading it up with goods, but he didn't see any movement at all, and after a couple of minutes his curiosity burned. "I am kind of out in the open here," he thought. "Might as well get some cover and go in for a closer look." He hopped back into the truck, starting it up and driving around the south side of town. He went off-road once he got to level terrain, hoping he was far enough away to not alert them with noise. When he reached the edge of town, he backed the truck behind a building a block off of the main road through town. He grabbed his rifle and readied it as he started to move on foot. Atticus reached the first building, looking out down the highway through town, not seeing much. There were a few corpses scattered about, but they were too far away to determine if they were zombies or humans. Before he moved any further, gunshots echoed in the distance, putting him on edge. Maybe they're taking down some stragglers, he thought, but it was wishful thinking. Multiple gunshots cracked, coming from different directions, both the east and the west of the north side of town. Or not, he thought dryly. He moved up to the next block where a row of businesses stretched for several blocks. When he pressed himself up to the side of the building, movement caught his eye on the left. He focused and spotted civilians moving up the street while firing. A moment later, one of them took a bullet to the gut and went down, screaming for help. Atticus wanted to do something, but he knew if he broke cover he'd be in the middle of it, and as an unknown to both sides, he'd be most likely to be taken out. It was a moot point anyway, as a split second later the poor guy took another round to the chest, silencing him. "No!" somebody else screamed, and popped up from behind a car, firing wildly towards the assailants. He emptied an entire magazine from his rifle before retreating back behind cover, just in time to avoid returning fire. "This isn't your fight, Atticus," the ex-ranger chanted under his breath. "This isn't your fight." Several more civilians joined the battle, coming out from the stores and laying down suppressing fire so they could spread out. Atticus looked around at the building he was beside, going back to a window on the side and breaking it out in order to get inside for more cover. He quickly swept the small clothing store, not finding any threat, neither zombie nor human. He moved to the front of the store, watching the battle play out through the floor-to-ceiling windows. From his vantage point, he could see the deserter soldiers fighting their way up the street, using covering fire for one of them to move up way further than was strategically necessary. "What are you up to?" Atticus thought, brow furrowing in confusion as he watched. The lead soldier signaled back to his buddies to pop up and lay down fire, and they did so. As soon as their shots began, he broke from cover, running towards the two-story building next to him, firing a few shots to shatter the ground floor window and crash inside. The firefight continued for several moments until the deserter appeared on the roof of the building. Atticus watched as he pulled out a grenade from his belt, yanking the pin and lobbing it at the group of civilians fighting on the street. Atticus's eyes widened, and he took cover as it detonated, sending shrapnel all over the street. Windows shattered, including in the building the ex-ranger was in. He got up, squinting through the dust to see what was happening. The deserter on the roof held a hunting rifle, taking aim and firing off several rounds towards the civilians. Atticus gritted his teeth as one of them took a shot to the chest and crumpled to the ground. As the fallen man's partner tried to flee, another shot went off, hitting him in the leg. As he screamed for help, a couple of his friends tried to come out and help him, but the sniper shot at them, hitting the ground just in front of them and pushing them back. "Why aren't you hitting them?" Atticus wondered. "Is he not bait?" He watched the sniper reload his rifle, taking aim at the group that were frantically fighting, trying to get to their injured friend. None of their shots were coming close to the sniper, leaving them as sitting ducks. Finally, the ex-ranger had had enough. "Don't know who you are, but you owe me one," he muttered, and pulled his rifle forward, putting the sniper in his scope and firing. It was an extreme angle, given how close he was to the building, but the shot was mostly on target. The bullet impacted the edge of the building, sending debris flying up towards the shooter and forcing him to retreat. "Yeah, that's right. Back on down," he muttered, and stayed trained on where the shooter was, just waiting for him to pop back up. Finally he did, aiming his rifle in the general direction of the clothing store, but he quickly fired. This time Atticus's aim was off, and the bullet hit lower on the top of the building, though it still forced the sniper back down. "Third time's the charm," the ex-ranger said. "You'd better think twice before you pop back up." He kept his sights trained on the rooftop, waiting for the shooter to bring his head above it again. Instead, a hand shot up for a brief second before vanishing again. "What the hell was that?" Atticus asked. But before the words were even through his mind, a heavy metal sound thunked on the ground right outside the store, and a grenade bounced towards him. He jumped up, running to the rear of the store and diving for cover just as it went off. What was left of the front of the store disappeared in fire and shrapnel, a deafening boom stunning him for a moment. The concussion blast messed with his head as he struggled to get back to his feet, finally getting his rifle in his hands as he aimed back up towards the building just in time for the other two deserter soldiers to show up out front. Both of them fired into the building, but it was dark and filled with smoke, so there was a good chance they couldn't see what they were shooting at. Despite that, it was more than enough to make Atticus duck down, firing in retaliation as he ran to the back of the building. He slid underneath the counter, ducking behind it for cover as the gunfire continued. Before he returned fire, he could hear them talking. "Make sure he's dead," one of them barked. "I'll take care of the package." "On it," the other man replied. Atticus listened carefully as the disgraced soldier stepped into the building, his boots crackling on the broken glass as he moved. There were clicks and clacks as he checked his rifle, then the cocking sound as his hunter readied himself, the footsteps getting closer and closer. The deserter was roughly halfway into the building before Atticus rolled into the opening underneath the counter and fired his rifle towards the middle of the store. He sent several rounds downrange, quickly followed by return fire and hurried footsteps running to the side. "Don't know who you are, but that's a bitch move," the deserter cried. Atticus smirked as he got up into a crouched position. He couldn't believe the nerve of this asshole using a sniper on civilians, then whining about fair tactics. He moved quietly along the counter, staying low and trying to figure out where his opponent was. It didn't take long before the counter was shredded by bullets, forcing Atticus to flatten himself on the floor for cover. As soon as the firing stopped, he popped up and sent a wild burst of rounds in the general direction of the shooter, before ducking back down. A yelp echoed from the other side, followed by the sounds of footsteps clumping on the floorboards as the other man took off for the street. Atticus got up, but immediately ducked back down, narrowly missing bullets whizzing wildly back in his direction. "Well, definitely wasn't a kill shot," the ex-ranger muttered. He waited for a moment before getting back up, his rifle aimed towards the front of the store. He got up just in time to catch a glimpse of the ex-soldier jumping out the window and back to the street. Atticus moved quickly to the front of the store, fully in pursuit mode now. As soon as he emerged from the window, a gunshot cracked from above, a bullet hitting the wall mere inches from his head. He darted back inside for cover, shaking his head. "Oh, I'm going to get you for that one," he muttered. "Talk about me pulling a bitch move." He chuckled to himself, angry but full of the adrenaline of the fight that brought a smile to his face. Before he took a shot at the sniper, gunfire echoed from the next block up. It wasn't just a few shots, but sustained fire this time. "You're lucky I got other things to tend to," he grunted, and ran back through the storeroom, finding the door to the alley. He busted out, looking around and trying to get a read on the gunfire. Multiple rounds boomed off to his right, just up at the far end of the block. The gunfire intensified as he got closer, but he still couldn't see anybody. Once he got to the edge of the building, he looked out and spotted the 2 deserters taking cover behind a shot-up car on the other side of the street. Atticus didn't have a clear shot on them, as the car was on the corner of the street. The ex-soldiers shot from behind it, nearly in his direction, but focused across the street. Both men popped up from behind cover, firing at the same time before getting pinned down by fire. This was followed by them returning fire, which was when Atticus got ready to move. "Forget prisoners. You shoot to kill," he told himself. "Shoot to kill." He readied his rifle, waiting on the return volley of bullets. As soon as it started up, he rushed out from behind cover, gun raised up in the firing position. The deserters have no clue that he was there, as they were focused on the civilians shooting at him. Atticus made it out into the road, about halfway across the street, giving him a solid firing position. The shooter closest to him looked up, seeing the danger he posed, and attempted to raise his weapon. Atticus pulled the trigger several times, pumping a few rounds into his chest and dropping him. The shooter's partner flinched as the blood splatter hit him, and he looked towards the ex-ranger with shock in his gaze. He never got a chance to react as Atticus continued to fire. The bullets ripped through the ex-soldier, dropping his body to the ground. Atticus continued to stare down the scope, aiming at them to make sure they weren't going to move. Out of the corner of his eye, he spotted movement. Several civilians coming out from the stores, their guns all raised at him. "Evening, y'all," Atticus said with a tip of his hat. A young woman stepped ahead of the pack, running a hand through her short black hair. She looked to be in her early 30s, with a strong build and a tough jaw. "You mind telling us who you are?" she asked. "Well, ma'am, at the moment, I'm just a man who was hoping he made the right decision when it comes to which team to be on," Atticus said brightly. "Not the answer I was looking for," she replied, voice lethal. "Name's Atticus, ma'am," he said politely. She nodded. "Straightforward and polite," she replied. "Now we're getting somewhere. So, Atticus, what are you doing here?" "Well, I ran into these boys up the road in Wellfleet and followed them here to see what they were getting into," the ex-ranger explained, inclining his head towards the bodies. "For what reason?" she asked. He took a deep breath. "Got sent here to investigate the situation," he said, feeling like he could be honest about the situation with these people. She dropped her gun a little, but kept her finger in firing position. "Lower your gun and look at me," she instructed. Atticus glanced back down at the 2 shooters, making sure they were indeed dead. He complied, lowering his weapon and looking over at the woman, who walked closer to him. "Good," she commended. "Just wanted to look you in the eyes while we chat." "I'm good with that," he agreed with a nod, relaxing his shoulders. "What do you want to know?" "Who sent you to investigate?" she asked. He shrugged. "The U.S. government, I suppose," he replied, cocking his head. "Or the military, take your pick, since they're pretty much one and the same these days." She raised her chin. "Be very specific," she warned. "What did they send you here to investigate?" "I wish I could tell you," he admitted. No, she said, shaking her head emphatically. "There's none of this classified bullshit today." "Nothing's classified. There's just nothing to tell," Atticus explained. "The communications with the train yard in North Platte got knocked out, so they sent me to investigate." She raised a skeptical brow. "And that's it?" she asked. "They heard rumors about deserters, but that's all they had, rumors," he admitted. "Well, I can guarantee you that they aren't rumors," she said dryly. "There's a whole lot of truth behind that." Before they could continue, a vehicle started up in the distance. "If you'll excuse me," Atticus said, turning and sprinting towards the vehicle. He came around the corner, running down the street as it began driving out of town. As he ran, he glanced down at where the injured civilian had been, but he was no longer there. The ex-ranger didn't slow down, instead running towards it before turning down the side street towards his own truck. He pumped his legs hard, knowing that every second he wasted running, the further that truck would get from him. He finally reached his truck, throwing the rifle in while fumbling for his keys. He dropped them onto the floorboards and cursed under his breath as he retrieved them. As he shoved them into the ignition, the passenger door opened, and the woman from before shoved his guns over and jumped in, slamming the door shut. He froze for a moment, gaping at her. "Come on, get a move on," she urged in an authoritative tone. "They're getting away." He still wasn't sure what to make of the situation, so he responded the only way his southern gentlemanly upbringing would allow him to. He started up the truck, threw it into gear, and hit the gas. "Yes, ma'am." The end.